Good morning and afternoon, everyone, and you're all very welcome to our talk here today. My name's Sinéad, and I'm an SRE lead with Aspiegel SE here in Dublin, and delighted to be here talking at SREcon. So what do I do with Aspiegel? Well, I manage a few of our SRE teams, but also handle operations as well as training and development for our SRE department as a whole. And operations very much an area I've always worked on and enjoyed, which you're really going to see in the strong operational focus in our talk here today. And what are we talking about? Well, we're basically going to talk about scaling up an SRE team during COVID, which is not a particularly technical talk. It's focusing more on the operations of growing an SRE team, but it is at the same time highly relevant for all of you here, be you manager or engineer or tester or whatever part you play. And the reason being is that you never know when you will be involved in a scaling operation or recruitment tasks. And as SREs, you're probably used to getting into the back end of large and no doubt very complicated systems. But in management, we do the same. Our system is just the SRE department itself. Anyway, without further ado, let's jump on into our agenda. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we'll start with a quick introduction about who we are, what we do in Aspiegel, and then we'll shift on to discussing the impact of COVID, just very briefly, before finally moving on to looking at how we grew out our team in the middle of COVID and the challenges that we learned from this. And starting with who we are, well, Aspiegel is essentially a digital services provider management company based out of Dublin here in Ireland. And you'll have seen from the title of the talk that we refer to the world's third biggest mobile ecosystem. This, of course, is the mobile ecosystem of Huawei. And we host and manage the HMS, or Huawei Mobile System. Now, we manage this for end users in, say, Europe, America, Australasia, and a few other countries, as you can see here. And what this essentially means is that any end users in any of these countries, in fact, anyone on this call from any of those countries using a Huawei mobile app, some of which you can see here, will have to come through our system. So some of you, without knowing it, may come through our system on a daily basis. You can just imagine the scale here. Like, we're looking at millions of end users, people spread out across 60 countries, and over 100 front-end and back-end services, which are managed by ourselves just to keep everything up and running. So all very exciting. What's our setup? Well, our setup is actually fairly straightforward. We host our services on public cloud. We use public cloud on the continent, but we also have cloud here in Ireland. And we work actually with a 3-cloud solution for this. What else? Well, we deploy 1+1 configuration, no surprise there, just to make sure we have redundancy on any customer-facing services. Our management interface, as you can see, comes from our Aspiegel offices in Dublin and Finland, and that's because this is where our SREs are based. So this is where we have access to our production environment. Now, as we mentioned, the scale of our enterprise is fairly large. So we work with tens of thousands of machines, petabyte of storage, just to make sure we can support all the services and the millions of end users that are making use of them. Our main SLOs, really, we focus, of course, on availability and resiliency, which would be key for everything. But I won't get into them in too much detail because they're not relevant. Anyway, where did this talk come from? Well, the genesis really came from a couple of challenges that came our way early last year. Firstly, the decision was taken to transition away from a managed services SRE team, which we had used quite extensively along with our own. And this happened in tandem with a big projected increase in workload for the team. Now, the two of those together would have been tricky, but of course, with the same time, we had the sudden and rather complicated arrival of coronavirus and the closing of the offices. So really, everything came together to give us two very obvious requirements. Like, first, we had to scale up our team quickly. And secondly, we had to figure out how to work from home, and we had to leave our offices. And in fact, yes, that is actually the Aspiegel office you can see there in our screenshot, which hopefully we'll be back to soon. We're going to start off with the latter and just take a very brief look at how we worked with COVID. And really, so in Ireland, COVID had been sort of threatening in the month of March of last year, but there's a bit of a level of confusion as to how much it would actually impact us. And this all came to a head on Friday, the 13th of March, when the government effectively sent the country home from offices. requested that everyone who could work from home and do not go into the offices. Naturally, we felt this is a fairly temporary matter, probably like most other people. But because of this, we fairly reacted initially in a fairly, you could say, short-term manner, dealing just with the immediate requirements. And the immediate requirements for people working from home were as practical as you would expect. Did they have chairs? Did they have good screens? Did they have a solid internet connection? Could they connect in through our VPN? So all those basic matters were the first consideration for us. And then as we worked from home and started moving through the months, those practical requirements very quickly gave way to more of a societal need because people quickly realized they needed more interaction. And a DevOps SRE interacts fairly constantly with different teams, ours being no exception. So homebound SREs were feeling a little isolated. Not just this, but it was fairly hard to align on technical requirements and different processes from a distance. Now, to combat this, we actually had to build in communication paths, build in catch-up meetings and work paths, just to keep everyone in line. In fact, we almost had to overdo communication just to make sure we had enough of it. And this all worked fine, but COVID continued on. And as we moved through the months, really, the next topic to pop up was ergonomics. And this actually came from more the management side than that of anyone else, because, of course, we want to keep up the health of the engineers. Now, the trouble is not everyone is lucky enough to have a dedicated space to work at home. And a lot of the time, it's about making the best of what you have. So we wanted to look into tips and tricks for people, into short training sessions for the engineers, just to keep everyone in as good, healthy condition as possible. And finally, as we continued to move through the year, the unspoken concern to pop up, which soon appeared, was really around returning to the office. And well, yeah, the idea of seeing everyone again was, of course, fantastic. It needs to be acknowledged that we're looking at a big change for people when they have to go back. In fact, most of our team had never even met, so it was really quite a big deal. And this started becoming a consideration for us at about the 12-month mark. And looking into a couple of these requirements and how they happened through the years, just in a bit more detail, I suppose the first one we want to mention, because it's quite relevant here around the practicalities, would be that around the tooling involved. And this initially had us slightly concerned, but then we very quickly realized that an SRE team actually has a definite advantage here over other office teams. And it has an advantage in that it already works a lot with remote tooling. So if we consider various actions, various tools required by an SRE, the functions, if you will, like, say, deployment, monitoring, resource management, communication, any of these, like most of these can be implemented remotely by tools, and by tools which were in place long before COVID occurred. In fact, in our case here in Aspiegel, a lot of these functionalities were split out between different areas. So we already had that remote tooling in place. And just looking at us specifically, as you can see from the screenshots here, our CI/CD pipeline, we implemented by a tool we called Wiseye. And this allows for remote upload from the product developer side, but equally remote deployment from our side of the various product versions to the production environment. This also allowed us for remote resource management and alarm management, which was a fantastic tool, really, as it meant we were all accessing it from home without any issues. Equally, as an example, our monitoring tool, AIOps, this allowed for remote monitoring of our KPIs and our SLOs, just to make sure there was no loss in quality on any of our key products, which we would be keeping an eye on. Now, other SRE teams no doubt have similar remote-oriented, I should say, office tools. And it does really set us up for success as an industry when we're in this situation where we have to be away from the office. But this doesn't take away from the issue around communication. And as we mentioned, communication was a huge consideration for us, and interaction was a huge consideration. And really, we started to break it down and actually consider the communication mediums we were using themselves. When you look at the composition of communication, you're not just looking at words. You're looking at words, you're looking at tone, you're looking at body language, and all of this coming together to convey a meaning to a person. So it's really important when you're remote to actually consider the best medium for whatever you wish to communicate. And if you think about it, the easiest, but probably also the least rich method of communication, this would be instant messaging or email. And what we get with this is we get words, maybe we get a small element of tone by using emoticons or smileys. And while it's very easy to initiate this for quick, light, non-complicated information, for more complicated discussions, this wouldn't be used. When we are moving on to more complicated or more back and forth discussions, we would probably shift up to one of the next media, I should say, of communication. And that would be the voice call would be the next one. A little more effort involved to set it up, but also a far richer overall communication because we get both the words and the tone that's used here. Voice calls, of course, very useful if there's going to be a lot of back and forth because they're far quicker than I am for a conversation that has to happen in real time. And now the video call, which would be our next medium, this is a step up again from the voice call in terms of effort. You have to put on the camera, but also in terms of richness of communication. And this is because we're getting limited body language here as well, from say the shoulders up. And we're also getting eye contact with the video call. So video calls, these are very suitable for more formal events, such as, say, team meetings, training sessions, welcoming new people. And they allow that kind of visual connection between the engineers. And finally, of course, the richest form of communication, as we all know, probably comes from in-person talking, because what we're getting here is we're getting everything. We're getting full body language, eye contact, tone, voice, absolutely the whole shebang. Now, this is naturally the most complex too, especially in the time of COVID when engineers are working from home. So really, it's going to be limited to be used in highly important conversations or if you need collaborative discussions. And the overall challenge we found was knowing when to start communicating, where to start communicating, but also at which point to shift between your methods of communication. When one isn't working, just being able to say, okay, I'm just going to pick up the phone, give you a call instead. And that's just a very quick look at the whole concept of communication just while we're talking about COVID. But actually what I'm going to do now is shift away from that. And the reason I want to shift away from that is I want to talk a little bit now about how over the course of the year we really scaled up our team while all these various COVID issues were, of course, going on. In fact, we would go from having about maybe 20 or 25 SREs in April to being over 100 strong today. So next up, we're going to talk a little bit about that, just how we did it and what we learned. And this is just in the hope, really, that what we did will help other people. So yeah, as mentioned earlier, we lost our managed services team. We had an increase in workload, and this meant we needed to scale dramatically. But of course, we couldn't just jump into it all at once, bring in everyone at once. We wouldn't have had the resources to do this. And building out an SRE team, it takes time, and it's a cliche, but it takes patience as well. Now, much and all as I'd love to say we did everything perfectly, that was, of course, not the case. What we present here, and indeed what we talk about in the following slides, is more what we learned is the optimal way of building out a team and what we would recommend anyone to do if they're following the same paths. And really, I would say it breaks down to these steps. It's planning your growth timeline, it's planning your hiring, your onboarding, making sure you have all your documentation in place, it's considering knowledge development, and it's considering your tooling as well. And the key thing to take from this really is that growing or building a team, it's not just about hiring people, walking away, job done. It's about far more than that. And we're going to go into that in more detail now. And before we jump on into looking at things like recruiting or anything, we really want to consider what difference an increase in numbers is actually going to make to a team. And we're looking here really at the difference between a small SRE team and a larger SRE department. And firstly, in a small team, everyone knows everyone. You've got a lot of tribal knowledge. Everyone knows who to go to get different tasks completed. And when we shift that to a larger team, the model doesn't come true completely because tribal knowledge, well, will always be present, but it cannot disseminate quickly enough to everyone. So for this reason, it's really important to have everything documented when you're working with a larger team. So processes, procedures, it's vitally important. Essentially, any action that a member of the team will take. And equally, too, you want to assign owners to different areas, like, I don't know, change management, business continuity management, even people management, different aspects of it, just to be sure you can put regular reviews of that documentation in place. Very important, of course, process in itself has to be realistic or it's not going to be followed. It needs to be efficient. And there has to be a sort of a channel, if you will, for engineers to challenge the process. If they find something that doesn't work for them, or if they want to make a suggestion to speed things up or to make things better. So it's essential to have this because it's one of the key ways in which we can improve ourselves as teams, and we can become leaner and we can become a better SRE department. So that's just briefly talking about process there, but now I want to move into talking about growth. And as we said, we've got to start off by planning what our growth is going to look like for the year. And really effective headcount planning, it should happen regardless of scaling plans for the year. And some version of what we're discussing here, it's going to happen in most countries, or most companies, I should say, at the start of each business year. So effectively, we want to start off by finding out who we need. And we do this by documenting as much as possible what work, what projects, what responsibilities are incoming for the year. Now, realistically, it's not always possible to be precise here, but if we can have some idea, then that's going to help us out. It will give us an idea of how many heads we need. And if we know how many heads we need, then the next question is, of course, what area are those heads going to be in? And this is important because new work streams will require new knowledge, probably new processes as well, whereas an increase in current workload will require similar knowledge. And coming out of this, we know the types, we want to get the experience levels of the new heads so that we know when we need people, we know what we need, and we know who we need. And then finally, we want to combine all of this together with our projected employee loss rate for the year, which should be easy enough to model. And we want to create a timeline of when and what heads we need on a monthly rate or a quarterly rate, indeed, right throughout the year. And what this does is this gives us that comfort of knowing that we have a plan in place for scaling. We know who and we know when. And this is just going to mean that when these new responsibilities come in, we've got the people in place to take them on. Now, of course, this is not an indicator of when we start recruiting because we actually have to count back to allow for time for the recruitment process. We need to allow for the notice period, and then we need to allow for the onboarding ramp time. This easily adds up to 3 months, if not more, depending on the complexity of your recruitment process. So you can see from this, you want to keep your recruitment process itself as lean as possible. And speaking of recruitment, there's no harm breaking it down here, I think, as part of the overall scaling process. Like when you want to advertise for a role or roles, there's 5 key areas that need to be defined. And this is before you get into human resource areas such as salary or so forth. That would be, of course, you need your job description, you need your target candidate profile, like who are you looking for? You need to know how many interview stages you're going to have, who will be involved in each, and what competencies they are looking for and what competencies they're comparing people across. Now, it makes sense to actually have all these set down before advertising the role because this prevents delays later on. It's not everything to be considered, though. As you can see here, there's some very important questions. So who's going to source the candidates? Would it be recruiting? Would it be an external partner? How will they do it? You also are going to need clarity on who makes the final decision. Will it be HR, engineering? It's a good idea to clarify this early on because, again, it prevents delays when you're trying to get something over the line at the end. And operationally speaking, you want to try and prevent delays as much as possible. Now, next, it's good, plan your overall projected time to hire. And this is important because it's going to come into your yearly scaling plan. And finally, and probably by far the most importantly, you've got to define who will coordinate the whole process, who's going to track everything, where you're at, where everyone is, and report back on it. And really, this person is essential in any situation, especially if you're hiring a large number of people continuously, because they can tell you exactly where you are at any time. They can explain where your pipeline is and what you can expect to see coming in over the next few months. this is really a situation where you can leverage your company's recruiting and HR teams to assist. But if this doesn't work out, we'd recommend using a PM, or if you don't have one, locating the natural project manager in your team. There's always one. And assigning them the task, because you've got to have that administrative control over the scaling project. And yep, this is brilliant. So you've hired all your people. Once you've done and dusted with that, the next obvious step really is to consider the onboarding process. And onboarding one or two people is relatively straightforward. You can deal with questions quickly. But onboarding a large chunk of engineers, it's a bit trickier, and really it requires a fully defined plan for all newcomers. And this comes back to that requirement for process for everything. Really, of COVID and remote onboarding, this just highlights this need further, because there's no chance for a new employee to just turn around, speak to the person next to them and ask a question, not when they're working from home. And thinking about newcomers and where they're at, like joining a new company can be tricky. And for the most part, we're a bit nervous, we're a bit unsure of ourselves, even highly experienced people, because we don't know the company, we don't know the scene. So a bit of reassurance is required, like especially in the first couple of weeks. And this is where a really well-defined onboarding plan can be almost comforting to a person. Now, the plan itself, it's got to clearly state what is to be covered each week. Okay, so you want to have at least the first 4 weeks of employment, if not more. It should state how it will be covered, what the deliverables are, and any materials, they should be hosted online. They've got to be easily accessible for everyone. Ideally, the whole process would be automated as much as possible too. So you can see an example here actually on the screen of just how we do it. Mentors would also be assigned, but because some questions are going to be inevitable, and it's quite a useful way of spreading the workload for onboarding. So in addition to having an onboarding plan, it actually makes a lot of sense to establish some sort of support group for each group of new starters. And the reason behind this is that, one new starter has a question, it's quite likely others will have the same question. So it makes sense just to get that answer out to everyone. And I think you can see here, we chose IM for this. It's a good medium for a support group. And it also allows for whichever experienced engineer happens to be free at the time to give a hand to answer questions to people. So this is looking at onboarding. And when we've kind of hit that 1 or 2 month mark and we've got that ramping period done and people are moving into really settling into their roles, we do need to consider what happens next. And the reason for this, of course, is that engineers are not all knowledgeable once they hit that 1 or 2 month anniversary and that ramp period ends. And we need continuous development, and we need to have easy access to stored knowledge for them as they move into that sort of 2 to 6 month period. And in this particular period, they're going to just settle down into their common tasks. So for this reason, some form of comprehensive knowledge base is really required, just to store all that tribal knowledge we spoke about on tasks, how to complete them. Basically, any action an engineer takes in their role should be documented somewhere, just so in case someone else needs to do it. And of course, most major companies will have some form of run list documentation, some form of knowledge base. But it is worth highlighting here that it is an action that has to take place as you shift from a small to a large SRE department if you don't initially have one. And it's not just because tribal knowledge can't disseminate as effectively in a large department, but it's also because you've got more engineers to author it. You've more resources to write things up, and you've more enthusiastic people coming in, figuring out what they need to do and willing to upload to it. So this is very important to have. Worth mentioning, of course, that it's got to be well structured. It's got to be easy to search through to find what people need. Otherwise, there's the potential of having it grow to a point where it becomes unusable. So structure hugely important here. And like a good knowledge base, it's part of our team infrastructure. It assists knowledge development, doesn't replace formal development either. So things like ILT training sessions or external training or external meetups or conference attendance, these are considered separately, but these really can come in afterwards when a person is building on their solidified knowledge. So that's fine. We've considered now, we've brought in our new people, we've planned for them, we've considered their further knowledge, and we've got to move away from people now and look at a different area. And when we were planning for increasing the size of our team, one area we didn't really consider was the impact on the tooling, which wasn't very proactive of us. Me especially, as one of the teams I manage happens to be the tooling team. But we learned from these things, of course, always. And the problem with tooling issues is that they do tend to announce themselves in a bit of a blaze with a problem rather than giving you any warning that they're on the way. This is certainly the situation with us. And the type of tooling issues which presented really were in areas like login limits, capacity limits, license issues, and general IT attention that we were getting for having more traffic. So we dealt with these issues, of course, and we learned from them. But really the problem was that because we hadn't planned for them, we were very much in reactive mode. And the key takeaway here is when it comes to tooling, try and be as proactive as possible. If you know usage is going to dramatically increase, try and anticipate where the problems can occur, which of course isn't easy, but we do our best. One area now that we did have a lot of success around in tooling was in creating IM support channels for each of our widely used tools. And this meant that if an issue occurred, the engineer could immediately reach out to the administrator for the tool and get assistance. And this really reduced our engineer downtime. It also allows for collaboration on problems, and it prevents that situation where you have 20 people contacting the administrator separately for the same problem. And then not so much of an issue in a small team, but as you scale and you're building out a big team, you really need to put these channels in place. And yeah, the last area we want to take a look at here in terms of scaling up a team, it's probably also one of the hardest for managers, and that's facing the inevitability of people moving on and leaving the team. And we don't like to think too much about this, but you're always going to have a certain percentage turnover rate. And as you scale up, this means that higher numbers of people will sadly choose to leave, like even with the same rate. And it needs to be managed, really. So we manage it by thinking like engineers and applying our same engineering principles that we would apply to our people. As we said earlier in the presentation, in Aspiegel, we deploy our services in a 1+1 configuration across multiple AZs. We do this for a very obvious reason, redundancy. So if one AZ should go down, we need to be able to get the service up and running immediately by switching over. And in the same way, we need to be able to apply redundancy across our SRE workforce. So in the event that a person should get sick, leave, or become otherwise unavailable, there needs to be a backup in place to step in, continue with their tasks, and this gives us uninterrupted coverage. So every key task should have a primary and a secondary engineer in place. And not to mention, of course, documentation on its operation, just so that we don't have an overall loss of knowledge when a user should leave. So on top of this, like you've got things like succession planning, to avoid losing specific talent, full handover process, leaving processes that all need to be in place. And that goes without saying, really. But in addition, to avoid an overall impact on your team, you can model in advance the number of people that you would expect to move on and feed this back into your growth plan, as we said earlier. And this just means that leavers are covered by new joiners and you don't have an overall loss of operational ability. And yeah, that's really just summarizing everything we wanted to talk about there in terms of scaling up. So where does that leave us then? Well, after a year and change of COVID and some fairly extensive ramping and a whole lot of interviews, I'm happy to say that we are still hiring. Please do come look us up and join us. We can definitely promise it'll be interesting. What else? Well, at this stage, we're fairly settled into what we're doing, how we're doing it. We've sort of learned by experience and put the processes in place. It is worth mentioning that people are tired, though. And, I think this probably applies to everyone after the time we've had. And not physically as such, but more mentally speaking, COVID has been a bit of a drain on people, which we are now happily coming out of, I'm glad to say. And speaking of, we are happy to be finally returning to our offices next month. So most of our team has never met each other in person. Really looking forward to doing so, and we're really looking forward to finally checking out that office. That brings me to my conclusion here. I hope this talk was very useful to you, either if you're planning to scale up your team, or indeed if you're just interested and wondering what managers think about on a daily basis. You're Mina Magwiv galore. Thank you very much for attending. And do feel free to message me. You can use that email address or on LinkedIn if you have any further questions. More than happy to have a bit of a chat about anything we've discussed today. Finally, a big thanks to the SREcon committee for getting everything up and running and inviting us here to talk. And I do hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. So, slán go fóill.